Obviously, the last few years have not been the most productive year for Ohio Democrats and Republicans. Is everyone ready to come to the table when it comes to actually getting things done?
Well, that's the big question. And, we always start a new General Assembly with a lot of optimism and hope that there will be good work done by the General Assembly. And inevitably, depending on whose perspective, that either works or it doesn't work. And so we will start this new General Assembly with both a new House Speaker, a new Senate President. So it remains to be seen what their priorities will be moving forward. I mean, we certainly, as the Ohio House Democratic Caucus, we will continue to maintain those priorities, putting people first, trying to come to agreement, bipartisan agreement on issues where we can. You'll see many of the same priorities that we have focused on in the past continue to be our priorities. We're going to also be very laser focused, and I think the last election cycle is helping us laser focus on, how do we reduce cost and the cost of living for everyday Ohioans and providing relief, and that comes in a variety of different forms, but really taking a hard look at, how our priorities align with what I think voters have very clearly said that they are concerned about.
One of the things you mentioned was those leadership changes, and Matt Huffman is coming in as the new Speaker of the House. So, have the two of you had any conversations regarding priorities for this new General Assembly?
Well, we haven't yet focused in on priorities, and there will be opportunity for those conversations, and that typically happens. But yes, we've had conversations. Right now we're getting the yesterday was our first day, so just officially getting everyone sworn in. Still have to get committees organized and members appointed to committees. And then we'll move forward from there. We also, as a caucus, we will have a retreat coming up very soon where we will also begin to narrow in on our priorities. So what you'll see in this first sort of 6 weeks of the General Assembly is a lot of organization getting to the point where you'll actually see bills introduced and committee work start to happen.
One of the things we saw on election night was the failure of Issue 1, which would have created that Citizens Commission to engage in redistricting here in Ohio instead of having elected officials do that. So, with the failure of Issue 1, what do you think redistricting is going to look like in the future? Will it come up down the road? Because I know Governor Mike DeWine, he agrees that the system in Ohio has to change for redistricting, but he didn't support Issue 1. So, what about the Iowa model? How do you feel about that and what we could see with
Well,
redistricting
let's
here?
be very clear that issue one failed in November because voters were confused about what was on the ballot, and that was intentional. If you ask most voters, do they agree that politicians should not be part of the process that draws their own lines? We know overwhelmingly people agree with that. I wouldn't take a failure of issue one in November to mean that people don't support the idea that the process needs to be changed, and it needs to be an independent process that is less susceptible to political influence, putting politicians putting in their thumb on the scale. The governor has talked about, the Iowa proposal. I think that there are pros and cons to that. The biggest concern I have with that is that ultimately politicians have a say in that methodology. And I think that, as we have seen in Ohio throughout this process, has been the problem and is the concern by the public. So I don't know if reforms will be made to the process. What I can tell you is we know that the congressional districts will have to be redrawn as required under the current process because there was not bipartisan agreement to those maps. So we will see how that progresses, and we'll see if additional reforms are proposed.
And one of the issues that we do expect to come up at some point is with the recreational marijuana law. Obviously, Ohioans voted to support that, but there is the possibility that changes will be happening to the law. So, is there an idea as to when that could be coming up and who exactly would be leading those changes?
Well, I anticipate, that there will likely be some action put forward on that issue, the recreational marijuana issue. I mean, listen, it's no secret that now Speaker Huffman and Senate President McCauley did not like what the voters passed a year and a half ago. And there have been many of us in the General Assembly, both Republicans and Democrats, who have pushed back on attempts to fundamentally change what the voters voted on and put forward. Do I think that there is room for improvement on some things like how do we better protect minors? How do we address the issue of Delta 8 and its access? There's some really good discussions and probably some policy changes that we need to move forward in that respect. But I think you will see my caucus, as well as probably some Republicans, very opposed to huge, large scale changes to the recreational marijuana program as it has been passed by voters and as, frankly, it has been now implemented for the last several months.
And obviously, the sales speak for themselves. It's a booming business in the state now. And obviously, the state has that 10% tax on it, collecting revenue from this. So, in terms of that money, we have an idea of where it's going, some of it for addiction services, some of it for communities. So, do we have any examples of how that money has been spent thus far?
Well, again, the revenue is still coming in at this point because the program is rolling out. But what was passed by voters, was pretty clear about where that revenue should go and how it should be spent. And frankly, that's one of our biggest concerns is what sort of changes will be attempted to be made to how those revenues are distributed, particularly to the local communities that have, decided to allow, for example, the distribution or the processing or the growing facilities in those communities. And so taking that revenue away from those communities who've made that decision to invest in this business and putting it to the state to decide, how to distribute in the way that it feels best is of concern to us because we want this money to go back to our local communities and back into the communities that have been most impacted, frankly, by poor policy in this space in the past.
So, it's safe to say there is that delay that tends to happen with these revenues. So, it should be a while then for when we get that revenue in.
Yeah, we don't have, I think, a full sense of what the total revenue is going to be or what is sustainable or how much it will grow over the long term, because frankly, the program in terms of its actual implementation is still fairly new and only, a couple months out.
And one other issue that the state legislature has had to tackle in the past few years has been education. And obviously, coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that a lot of students were still behind. And we're starting to make some strides, but some we saw in the recent state report cards, some school districts didn't perform too well. And so, what supports is the state going to be able to maybe throw in to help out those districts?
Yeah, well, that the addressing the learning loss piece, that there's still the residual effects of that from COVID continues to be a challenge for some school districts. I mean, listen, in this whole space of public education, K through 12 education in particular, I think you're going to see this is really where I think potentially some of the big policy disagreements are going to happen. And that is, how do we continue to fully fund our school districts so that they can meet the needs of students and our communities? 90% of Ohio students attend public schools. And so we feel very strongly that public dollars should be prioritized towards those public schools and their needs. And so, that will be a concern for us moving forward. And how do we make sure that our public schools are prioritized? And I anticipate there will be lots of strong debate. There will be lots of strong debate in this space.
You just mentioned that this is one of those issues that's hard to find agreement on. Why is that still the case? Because obviously this is an investment in the future when we're talking about students, but the state legislature seems to really take its time when addressing it.
Well, I think, a lot of the ways that we see the space addressed is in the state operating budget. I mean, fundamentally, what money do we put towards public education in the state? And how do we fund our schools? And do we do it at the level that is appropriate? I think by and large, most legislators, we represent districts where we have communities. Our public schools are the center of our communities. We love our public schools, but we need to make sure that that's reflected in the policies. And I think we've seen a lot of very detrimental policies in this space come out of the last couple of General Assemblies, particularly in the massive expansion of voucher programs. For example, some of the attacks that we've seen on the ability of teachers, to have content in their classrooms. And in a variety of ways, we've seen attacks in this space that have been concerning. But we'll see, what continues to move forward. And I think this is going to be an issue where it's not going to be Democrats versus Republicans. I think you're going to see lots of people have different sides on this issue that hopefully are reflective of the communities that they represent.
And finally here, is there anything in particular that maybe wasn't done in the last General Assembly that you would like to see done in this General Assembly?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we have talked about, we as the Ohio House Democratic Caucus have been very vocal on is how do we address rising property taxes and what sort of direct relief do we provide to homeowners, particularly those homeowners that are on fixed incomes like our older Ohioans. Because it is unsustainable at the rate that property taxes are increasing in many of our communities. We are all hearing about this issue, but unfortunately, there's been almost no action in this space to provide direct relief. We've been pushing for that. This previous General Assembly will continue to push for it in this current General Assembly. So you'll hear us talking about that a lot as well.
Well, Ohio House Minority Leader Allison Russo, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much. Always great to join you.